you so much for your attention until this time. And I see I've got a foolish idea to run a 2-day conference, but you all look as shattered as me. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your time with us. This is the final session, bringing together some of the themes and taking a more global perspective. We have 2 speakers. The first plenary speaker is Dr. Marcel Dawson from the University of Otago. I always say it wrong, Otago. Published widely in the fields of social movement, social activism, involved in the ISA, what do they call it, that panel about the social movements panel. And she's going to speak first for about 30 minutes. Then we're going to have our second speaker, then we're going to have a world-changing debate before rushing out into the streets. So get your energy up.
First of all, thanks to Gavi and Satnam and Aaron for this very generous invitation to come speak at the conference. When I accepted Gavi's invitation, I had no idea that I'd be speaking on the closing plenary, so thanks for that, no pressure. Plenary speaker. The discussions of the last few days, I think, have been very timely and very interesting, and every session that I've been to has been jam-packed. And over tea, I've heard several people commenting that they wanted to be in different places at the same time, which I think is a great compliment, not only to the organisers, but also to the speakers. I'm very aware, obviously, that some of you might want to be, prefer to be on bridges around the city or at the embassy, so thanks very much for staying. I do have some pictures for entertainment value to keep me here. As the title of my talk suggests, I am going to be touching a little bit on the issue of decolonizing the curriculum. And it was in some ways accidental. I didn't really know that some of these discussions were happening here at Warwick, etc. And they certainly are happening in South Africa, not so much in New Zealand. But I'm very mindful of what John Solomon said in the opening plenary yesterday. And indeed, I appreciate what he said about being careful about what we lose in the process. So I hope this talk will move us in a direction where we aren't at risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's certainly, I'm not up here to provide a blueprint or some kind of set of answers, but rather I'll be asking a series of questions, and I'd be interested to hear what kinds of discussions have been happening at this university and elsewhere in the UK. So in a collaborative effort on the role of intellectuals in the state-society nexus, which I think Corella, you've also been involved in, Ari Sitas, who is the head of sociology at the University of Cape Town, asks, or notes, we're living in a period when scientifically the idea of race has been totally discredited, but racism is escalating at a social, racism is escalating as a social force all over the world. So where does this leave us in this intellectual project that some of us might be involved in? To tackle this question, Sitas proposes an intellectual break from the European canons that have come to shape knowledge. This is, of course, not a new suggestion, and for decades, critical scholars and activists have been urging us to take indigenous knowledges and methodologies more seriously. For instance, in the New Zealand context, Linda Tuiwai-Smith, who is a Māori scholar based at the University of Waikato, she speaks about 2 different worlds that she has had to traverse, one of these being Māoridom, and the other being the world of research, and she specifically is referring to university-based research. And in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, which came out in 1999, so it's been out for quite a while, but there have been several re-publications of the book. And in this book, she sets out, and I quote from it, to disrupt relationships between researchers, mostly non-Indigenous, and research, Indigenous, between a colonizing institution of knowledge and colonized peoples whose own knowledge was subjugated, between academic theories and academic values, between institutions and communities, and between and within Indigenous communities themselves. Now, numerous texts in this vein have dismissed or highlighted the shortcomings of Western approaches. Some have taken it as a task to propose practical ways of producing Indigenous knowledges. But what I quite like about Smith's approach, and of course she's not alone in doing this, But what I like is that she puts the spotlight on the university as a colonizing institution, which enables us to question not only what comes out of the university in the form of research or knowledge, but also the very tools and formulae in line with which knowledge is produced, as well as the mechanisms and criteria that govern what constitutes knowledge. And thus, I think we can't really engage in a conversation about anti-racist futures through epistemological breaks without the consideration of the neoliberal university. Those of us who work and study at institutions of higher learning are all too familiar with the pitfalls of the neoliberal university, and tomes have been written on the subject of the corporatized university. So I don't really want to rehash a lot of those frustrations the user pays model that many of us face on a daily basis. Several of these things have come up over the last 2 days. Have also come up informally over tea time conversations with various people, graduate students and staff alike. But I want to pick up on just one angle that has to do with something that John Solomus alluded to yesterday, and that's the issue of teaching, which seems to have become the grunt work of academia. The thing that some staff fob off on their graduate students in the name of experience or CV building. And sadly, what I have heard some colleagues referring to as an inconvenience. In the neoliberal institution, the game is about publishing and running after grant money. Of course, these things have always been components of the role of an academic, but the stakes are now higher. And when I hear academics getting excited about receiving a grant, not because they're keen to do the research, but rather because it can buy them out of teaching, I feel a little bit nauseous. Because I, and certainly some of the discussions I've had with some of you over the last couple of days, certainly suggest that teaching is as important a tool, if not more important a tool, than for social change and research. Before I go on, I should just say that I'm coming at this issue from the vantage point of being a sociologist, and I recognize that not everybody in the room is a sociologist or an academic. I was educated in South Africa, in the UK, and after many years of teaching in South Africa, I now work at a sociology department in New Zealand. So these are some of the realities that shape this discussion. So primarily, the discussion is about two things: absences and epistemicide. And I want to talk about how these two things have closed the doors of culture and learning. This phrase is, of course, from South Africa's Freedom Charter, signed in 1955, and this particular tenet suggests that all the cultural treasures of mankind shall be open to all by free exchange of books, ideas, and contact with other lands. It's such a simple yet profound objective, and in a globalized, digitized world, one would think it could be easily achieved. But of course, globalization, as we know, is tied to an insatiable desire to commodify everything. In the university context, globalization is linked to rankings and league tables, which, among other things, rely on the internationalization of the curriculum and the standardization of assessment. In other words, a set of objective criteria by which we can measure and compare outputs. These expectations seem quite antithetical to learning and knowledge, particularly in social sciences. Yet within my own home discipline, sociology at least, researchers seem to have succumbed to the increasing pressure to write up their findings in the same rigid and formulaic way that one would write up a scientific experiment. Perhaps this is just my own personal bugbear, so I do ask for your indulgence. But certainly in the last few dissertations that I've examined and articles that I've reviewed, lengthy explanations of methods, it's not the methodology or the theory of the method, but rather the step-by-step process by which data has been collected and analyzed, has left little room for intricate and possibly messy conceptual work. Radical scholars from a range of social science disciplines, particularly critical geography, have long been encouraging us to conduct critically engaged, reflexive research and to be more transparent about the messiness of research. But I think that many of us are doing this in spite of how we were taught to think and conduct research. And what I'd like to suggest is that we move to a situation where the knowledge that we're producing is valid, honest, inclusive, respectful, reflexive, collaborative, and filled with complexity precisely because of what we've learned. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is these absences, which in this presentation I lean a lot on the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, who's a Portuguese sociologist. And this is not necessarily a new concept, but those who aren't familiar with it, Santos defined the sociology of absences as the procedure through which what does not exist, or whose existence is socially ungraspable or inexpressible, is conceived of as the active result of a given social process. The sociology of absences invents or unveils whatever social and political conditions, experiments, initiatives, and conceptions have been successfully suppressed by hegemonic forms of globalization, or rather than suppressed, have not been allowed to exist or to become pronounceable as a need or aspiration. Arguably, one of the biggest absences in American sociology and sociology more generally is the work of W.E. Du Bois. Scholars like Earl Wright II, who's at Cincinnati, and Raylan Rebecca at Colorado have done a remarkable job, I think, of unveiling the work of Du Bois. In the early 2000s, Earl Wright made bold and still controversial claim that the Chicago School, which has heavily flamed the sociology curricula not only in the US but around the world, is not the founding school of American sociology, but rather that the pioneering work done by Du Bois at the Atlanta University forged a path for sociology as we know it. Much of Wright's work of the last 15 years uncovers and revisits the impressive work produced by the Atlanta Sociological Laboratory. Raylan Rebecca's book, Against Epistemic Apartheid, explores at length the interdisciplinary nature of Du Bois's work and showcases his wide-ranging expertise in race, religion, gender, urban and rural sociology, education, and crime. Despite the work of scholars like Wright and Rebecca, Bois's contributions, to my knowledge, rarely appear in sociology syllabi. And if they do, they still tend to be treated as an add-on in sociology, as an additional viewpoint to the Chicago School, or even as an exotic sociology that differs from the mainstream. Advancing the work of Wright and Rebecca, Alden Morris, who's a professor of sociology and African American studies at Northwestern, set out to examine, as quote from here, the political, economic, cultural, and personality factors that led white social scientists to suppress Du Bois's scholarship of race and his unique contributions to the developing social sciences at the dawn of the 20th century. So this is all in his book that came out a couple of years ago called The Scholar Denied. And in the book, Morris argues that Du Bois' pioneering empirical research, which led to the finding that race is socially constructed, was distinctly at odds with the views of white social scientists who concurred with the general white consensus that blacks were created inferior and incapable of functioning as social equals of white. Acknowledging Bois's work as trailblazing would have required white social scientists to readjust their relationship to him, which Morris suggests would have been too ideologically jarring, so they chose to marginalize his work. Bringing the discussion a little bit closer to home for me, there have been some efforts in the South African and New Zealand context within sociology anyway to address the state of the discipline. The work in New Zealand took the form of a history of sociology, which sought to document how the discipline took hold in New Zealand universities. It was an interesting exercise, but perhaps it was also a missed opportunity to debunk the hegemonic narrative of the origins of the discipline. In the South African context, Fred Hendricks, who's a former Dean of the Humanities and HOD of Sociology at Rhodes University, and also past president of the South African Sociological Association, challenged South African sociologists to look to the continent and seek to engage other African scholars whose work is potentially of more relevance to South African sociology than that produced in Northern and Western contexts. Extending beyond the confines of sociology, but making a crucial point for a key aspect of sociological inquiry, Hlolela Mangu, who is just in front of us over here, who will speak next, urges us to recognize the value of our national archives for understanding our identity. More importantly, for this discussion, Hlolela warns against what he calls evidentiary genocide, and urges us to be more aware of how the archive is often employed to make certain identity claims and in the process to privilege certain identities' histories over others. So this brings me to the second part of the discussion on epistemicide. The metaphor of genocide is one that for a long time has captured the imagination of Boaventura de Sousa Santos, and in a collection of 4 edited volumes under the rubric Reinventing Social Emancipation Towards New Manifestos, Santos and his collaborators explore counter-hegemonic understandings of the Euro and Western-centric concepts of democracy, capitalist production, and education. They reveal other ways of knowing and seeing, which derive not only from the lived experience of those located in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, but also are shaped significantly by the struggles against oppression and marginalization. So in other words, these works drive home the point that production of knowledge is a relational exercise. These ways of knowing offer an alternative epistemological imagination for addressing the challenges of the 21st century. And they are consolidated in Santos's recent book, Epistemologies of the South, which is subtitled Justice Against Epistemicide. And in this book, and I think there's actually another one coming out next year or later this year, in the book, Santos claims that there is no global justice without global cognitive justice. This claim is underpinned by 4 central tenets. I won't go through all of them, I'll just, and they're up there so you can have a read. But I think in particular it is this last point, that the alternative to a general theory is the promotion of an ecology of knowledges combined with intercultural translation. I think it's this that helps to guard against what John Solomon yesterday called throwing away the classics. And I think also to some extent I should actually just say before I go on to the next point that for Santos, ecologies of knowledge means that different types of knowledge are incomplete in different ways, and that raising the consciousness of such reciprocal incompleteness rather than looking for completeness will be a precondition for achieving cognitive justice. So I think in some ways it'll also help us to question why the classics came to be the classics in the first place, and it takes into account other knowledges that would influence what we today recognize as the classics. And also what he's trying to do with this concept of intercultural translations is look at how in my Western knowledge is often seen as the truth based on research, while indigenous knowledges are seen as folklore, as myth, and as perspective. He's seeking a middle ground. Grossvogel shares Santos's ideas and shares his interest in the decolonization of knowledge, and he contends that the epistemic privilege of Western man in westernized universities' structures of knowledge is the result of 4 genocides or epistemicides in the long 16th century against Jewish and Muslim populations in the conquest of Al-Andalus, against indigenous people in the conquest of the Americas, against Africans kidnapped and enslaved in the Americas, and against women buried alive, accused of being witches in Europe. He discusses the links between these genocides and epistemicides and suggests that they created racial and patriarchal power and epistemic structures at a world scale entangled with processes of global capitalist accumulation. He argues that these racist and sexist epistemic structures are foundational to the knowledge structures of the westernized university. If you are interested in this, he does expand on these ideas in the book that came out last year, a co-edited book. It's more in the domain of philosophy, but nonetheless it might be of interest. So this is quite a damning critique of the university, which is rhetorically at least held up as the critic and conscience of society. Indeed, that phrase appears in New Zealand's Education Act. And it's a critique that leaves us with an enormous task if we wish to change existing epistemic structures and build anti-racist futures. Perhaps one way of doing this is through what I call insurgent sociology. It's not entirely the same as blackwashing the curriculum, because I think in some ways this will just be another form of epistemicide. So as Gandhi Bhattacharya and other contributors to the special issue of ERS in 2013 on race-critical public scholarship show, the demands of the neoliberal university are linked to the persistence of epistemic racism. As just one example of this, and I'm sure many of you have already been through this process, proposed research must always show that it will have an impact beyond the academy before it will be funded. And in today's universities, promotions and tenure depend on attracting grant money. And of course, yes, we can list all kinds of policy recommendations and platitudes about what the research is going to achieve. But how can we ever hope that our work has the potential to be emancipatory when we're working with such inadequate theoretical and methodological tools? So public scholarship and scholar activism have in recent years dominated discussions about how to increase the relevance of scholarly work beyond the university. And again, these are not new practices. As Professor Akhtar Brar discussed yesterday in relation to intersectionality, these things were going on long before they were given fancy names. And certainly when I speak to older activists and retired professors, it seems that the worlds of academia and activism were far more fluid and more mutually influential in the past. Indeed, the university has historically been a key site of social resistance. But it seems that in the attempt to label and theorize the relationship between scholars and activists, and of course there's a neoliberal logic at work here, it seems that in that process, we've drawn in some boundaries that were perhaps more fluid in the past. And I say this as a point of self-criticism. I'm one of those people who's written on scholar activism. This is not to say that there aren't sometimes tensions and treading on toes and feelings getting hurt in that relationship. It's all those things that come with a passionate and productive relationship. But I wonder if we've been overthinking things a little bit. Partly in response to the discussions about public scholarship, Bhattacharya questions whether learning must always be accompanied by doing. She proposes private sociology, which allows her to think about the dilemmas of political life without the pressures of having to do something. And I find this quite compelling, especially in a world where public scholar is being co-opted by university management to mean brand ambassador. But something that I've been toying with lately is insurgent sociology, question mark. And I think we can do this through the everyday practice of our teaching. And we can teach students about race and other forms of inequality through an unveiling of the distorted history of sociology. Maybe by revealing a more accurate history of the discipline will shed light on the skill of making evidence-based claims. I think we can broaden methodology courses, and some of us are already doing this, to include other ways of knowing beyond qualitative and quantitative methods. Not in some kind of inward-looking way, but I think to broaden it out so that it's not just an optional extra, an optional reading. I think if we seek a greater challenge, perhaps we can begin to develop a sociology of absences that speaks to our own local and national realities, and again, not in some kind of myopic way, but rather in a way that allows for comparisons between the silences in different locales. Insurgent sociology, in my view, goes beyond seeking a space outside the university to be a political actor, or carving out the space within the university where we can assuage our guilt of our complicity in neoliberal practices. Insurgent sociology entails changing the tools carefully and with consideration for existing understandings of the world in a way that makes an ecology of knowledges the new normal. Insurgent sociology also entails a duty to a public. Specifically here, I mean our students, who are often referred to as Generation Debt. After all, don't they deserve the chance to develop the tools to understand and hopefully act upon the conditions of their oppression?